think it's really important. And this is
Sorry.
something, oh, sure, no, no worries, no worries. This is something that I try to abide by when I am, because I'm not just someone who conducts research, I'm also a consumer of research for professionally and just in, in my personal life, like everybody else. And so I try to come up with some rules that I keep in mind when I'm a consumer of research that I wanted to share with all of you to keep in mind when it comes to researchers not being perfect. And so I really encourage all of you that, as a researcher, please know I don't have all the answers. And I really, really strongly encourage all of you to think and to not trust any researcher who claims to have all the answers. There may be people out there who do claim to have all the answers because they're a researcher. Actually, the more people claim and the more confident they are about how they know everything about everything, that actually it decreases my trust in them. And so that's where I really say, don't believe that I have all the answers or any researcher has all the answers. And I really strongly think that you should not trust anything that I say just because I say it. And I don't think you should trust any researcher who claims otherwise for that either. For me, it's really important that I will try to base anything I say on some research evidence. And it would be my hope that anyone listening to me would make their decisions about trust based on the evidence that I am sharing and not based on the fact that I am saying it. And there's a lot of really smart, well-spoken people, whether they're researchers or not researchers, who will confidently share with you something that sounds really, really appealing and can make a lot of sense. But if it doesn't have any research evidence behind it, that is where I start to question, well, how is it that we know that if you don't have the evidence behind it? Is it just because it's what you've observed? That's great. I've observed a lot of things too, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I should treat it as though there's a lot of strong empirical evidence behind it. And researchers make this mistake all the time. So I really just want to start off by reminding everybody, researchers are not perfect. And I encourage you not to trust any researcher who claims that they know everything about everything. So the second thing that I'd love for all of you to know is that researchers are approachable, or at least that we should be. Frankly, when I get an email from a parent or from a teacher asking a question, I'm thrilled. It's not a distraction from my work. I think answering your questions is a big part of my work. Now, that doesn't mean that I can drop everything immediately and just send you a 12 paragraph email that's directly answering your question. I have other responsibilities too. But I really do feel strongly that helping the community is a big part of our job. And I think and hope that you feel comfortable if you have a question, that you feel comfortable sending a message to me or other researchers. Now, if you send a 20-page email detailing every aspect of your life. I can't make promises that I'm going to be able to get through all of that. But if it's short and especially if it's about something that I actually know something about, I'm happy to engage in that. Where it's hard is if you ask me really important questions, and I know this is the type of question that most of you have questions about. They're things like, what school should I put my child in? What activities should I put my child in? Are there like those are great questions, and that I know those are the questions that you grapple with all the time, and you should be grappling with all the time to be able to give precise, accurate answers about your child in their situation. I don't know your child. I don't know their situation particularly well. What I can answer well is like, what does the research generally say about this type of program or this type of participation in this type of service or activity, if there's any research on it? I can talk to you about that, but about very specific things about your child, because I don't know your child, I don't know that. But I mean it. I put my email where my mouth is. If you've got questions, or this is another big thing. I know, given the way modern academic research works, a lot of our work is hidden behind paywalls, and so you see some absolutely ridiculous prices. If you see like, oh, here's this article or chapter, I'd love to read it, but they want like $50 or $25 for me to rent the chapter or the article for 24 hours. I strongly encourage you, if you can see who the authors are and if you see their email address, send them an email and say, hey, do you have a copy of this that I could look at? Because another thing, I didn't put this down, I wasn't planning on saying this, but I want to make this clear because I know it's not always apparent to everybody. The money that goes to the publisher that individuals pay to access those articles, I don't see that money. That goes to some giant multinational conglomerate. Publisher. That money does not go to me. Now it's different if you're buying a book or not buying a book. There's a chance if I wrote the book that the two that were mentioned earlier, I do see a little bit of money there. But for the art for those articles, I do not see that money. But if you email me or email authors, authors are often very, very happy to share versions of that don't fall under the publisher's copyright that they're able to share or connect you to a link with an open access version of it so that you can actually see the research. And frankly, when I get emails like that, it's not a distraction. It's actually flattering. I'm thrilled that another human being says, there's something that I actually want to spend my time reading about and I want to know more. I consider it a huge compliment. It is not a burden at all. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about researchers can make mistakes and we're fallible. And the third thing I'd like to focus on is that assertions do not equal evidence. And in the academic research world, or in just this modern world where we're trying to grab people's attention, we will often say things in such a way that sounds like it's this declarative statement that could be supported by tons and tons of studies that could actually just be someone making a claim or about their beliefs. And it's not actually supported by a lot of evidence. And for people like me who are researchers, it's really important to distinguish something that's backed by evidence and something that's just a claim that I'm actually making. So, my favorite example to use this to demonstrate it, it's pretty controversial in my household, though I don't understand why. Through the example, here's an example of an assertion that I believe peanut butter is better than chocolate. Now, if you look at how that sentence is written, that sounds like it's a factual statement in that the way it's written. It's not started like in the opinion example of I think that peanut butter is better than chocolate, but the a lot of researchers and research statements you'll see is written as a factual statement when it may actually just be a claim that doesn't have any empirical or research evidence behind it at all. And that can be tricky because then when you hear this assertion written in such a way that makes it like a factual statement claim, it's easy for some people to then assume it to be what I would call like a universal truth. Like a universal truth being like everyone thinks that peanut butter is better than chocolate. And if you don't know much about the topic, you may actually accidentally believe, oh, I didn't know that everyone thinks peanut butter is better than chocolate. And I have permission to share this, to divulge this information. My wife is an exception to this belief. She does not believe that peanut butter is better than chocolate. She prefers chocolate to peanut butter, which is probably not that bold a claim. But the whole point, or not the whole point, but one of the biggest points about conducting research is to take these two claims or to take this topic and to gather information and to find out which one of us, my wife or me, is the weirdo, and which one of us is represents the more general belief in the population. So which one, and that's where in research where we want to find out, we may see an example or an anecdote of something or of someone doing something some way. Do we generalize from that person or that observation to say, is that generally true? And so in research, you may say, oh, this kid had that experience in that school. But what a lot of parents and consumers of research want to know is if I send my kid to that environment, will they have a similar experience? Or I know a lot of teachers and principals will say, oh, that intervention or that program worked in that school over here. If we have a similar program in my school, will we expect to get similar outcomes and similar effects? Totally reasonable goals to have. But the way to answer that is through research, is to see how generalizable some of those effects are. So to take this assertion or claim to actually get some evidence, you'd want to do something like have 1,000 people taste. And if they tasted both and they gave higher ratings to peanut butter, then you could start to say some version of oh, peanut butter is better than chocolate. But then my favorite answers to give whenever my students are asking me questions And I always tell them, if I'm ever asking them, one of the safest answers to give to any type of question related to research is it depends on the situation. So peanut butter is better than chocolate. Are you trying to give your dog its medication? Yeah, peanut butter better than chocolate. Chocolate's not too good for many dogs. You want to avoid that. Are you making a sandwich for your kid's lunch? If they've got peanut butter allergies, peanut butter not better than chocolate. But maybe you'd say for a sandwich, peanut butter is better than chocolate. Are you making a birthday cake? For a lot of people, chocolate might be better than peanut butter. It depends on the context and it depends on the situation. As we get through the talk a little bit more, you'll see more where it depends on the situation will matter. It depends a lot of research. Depends on the situation is very true for a lot of research statements too. Although often we talk in this generality universal statement, X is always better than Y. This is always better. But rarely in the research world do we actually ever find something where something is always better than something else. Typically, what we're talking about is general trends, which is still useful. If you want to know, oh, 80% of the time, 80% of the kids do better in this environment compared to that environment. That's useful information. But you don't always know, is your child going to be in that 80% or in that 20%? That's something where it's very, very personal and very, very specific. But when people like school administrators and policymakers have to make decisions, it's not that they don't care about the one individual kid, but they have to look at trying to make the best decision for kids more generally. And that's where I think it's really important to make that distinction between what are you claiming, what are you asserting, and what do you actually have evidence to support behind that. Now, transitioning a little bit more to giftedness. This is a long thing to remember, but it's that in giftedness, there's so many different definitions. I even co-edited a book where each chapter is based on a different definition or conception of giftedness. And then we ask the authors to say, okay, so that's your definition or conception, but what would it actually look like if a school were to implement its programs and services based on your definition? I think it's really important to pay attention to this because if you have a different definition, that can lead to schools offering different services. And if you have a different service, that can lead to it using different identification practices. And different identification practices can lead to different students actually being identified. I know it's kind of a lot of different steps. The visual I like to use is these nesting dolls, which I've loved since I was a little kid. I just love how they all fit into each other. And to think about for schools to be finding the right kids, you have to make sure that they're aligning all of the actions and the steps that they take with each other. So if you think about what is the school's goal, what are they trying to accomplish with their program, and then finding services that they can offer that are going to help them accomplish those goals of what they're trying to do in the programs. And then for the service to be successful, they have to find the right identification practices that will help identify the kids who are going to be successful within that particular service. But if it's a different service, they're going to need different identification practices. Just like the basketball coach doesn't have the same tryout as the swim coach because it's a different service, it's a different type of thing. For the school play, the audition process is going to look different if there's singing involved in the role than if there's not singing involved in the role. If there's no singing in the role, do you need to make the people auditioning sing? Maybe not. The same can be true within gifted ed programs and services. If you're offering an advanced debate team, or if you're offering a chess club or a math program, those are going to have different identification practices because who's going to thrive and who's going to flourish in those particular programs is going to be different from each other. And if you get any of these nesting dolls misaligned, you're going to be far less likely to have some problems along the way. Like you might be finding kids who aren't flourishing within the particular program. That doesn't mean the program's bad or wrong. Maybe just the identification process isn't particularly well aligned to that. You can have some great services, but if it's not aligned to a program goal, then the program goals may not be being met. And I think it's really important to remember that piece of the alignment of if you have different goals or a different definition, It's going to mean different services. It's going to mean different identification processes, which could mean it's going to be different kids who are being identified. And it's only when it's really all of those things are aligned that I think that our programs and students are really successful and thriving. This is a little bit of a deviation or a building on that last one. Identification practices really determine who we see within programs. I think it cannot be emphasized enough. And this is where I'm actually going to talk about a particular study that I absolutely had nothing to do with, but I absolutely love. Came out a couple of years ago by some European researchers who were doing research in Belgium, in the Flanders region of Belgium, actually. And they were asking a question that I think is on the forefront of minds of so many people within the gifted education community, which is, are gifted students prone to mental health issues? And so what they found is in this Flanders region of Belgium, of the students who had been identified as gifted, they found that adolescents who had formally identified as gifted reported higher levels of emotional problems, higher levels of worry, hyperactivity, and inattention, lower levels of global self-esteem compared to their peers who are not labeled as gifted. And so it's really easy to see results like this and say, okay, if this is who gifted students are, let's start making sure staff who are working with gifted kids are trained and have professional development to be able to identify these students who have these problems, make sure that their learning needs are being met. Let's really focus a lot of time and attention if this is what gifted students look like. But remember, my take home that I want you to know with this was identification practices determine who we see. So this is on adolescents who had been formally identified as gifted. How was gifted identified in this community? Well, in Flanders, there was actually no systematic testing in place. Really, the only kids who were identified as gifted were the kids who'd been referred to counseling and psychological services for some other reason that they were a problem that they were having. So then they were given this full psychological assessment, and some of the kids who'd been referred to counseling and psychological services and given the assessment happened to score really, really highly, and then they were identified as gifted. In the research world, this is the definition of what's called selection bias, because not all kids who would have been potentially identified as gifted, who scored really highly, had an equal opportunity to be identified. The only real kids who ever had a chance to go through any sort of selection process were kids who were already having psychological and counseling problems to the extent that they were referred to that particular department. And so the reason why I love this particular study was because they didn't stop at just looking at the profiles of identified as gifted kids. They went out and did a community sample and they gave an ability assessment to all adolescents. And then they looked at of the kids from the universal community sample who scored highly on the cognitive assessment, what did those kids look like? And what they found, I thought was absolutely fascinating. Of the kids with high cognitive ability, they reported lower levels of conduct problems, lower levels of hyperactivity, lower levels of inattention, higher global self-esteem, and no difference in worry or emotional problems than their peers of average cognitive ability. And so if you look at the profiles of these students compared to the profiles of the students who'd been identified as gifted, they look like almost completely mirror opposites of each other. And we would have no idea that this is what students with high cognitive ability looked like if they hadn't done that universal screening of the community sample. If they'd only relied on kids who'd already been identified as gifted, they would have had a very, very different picture and different profile of what students look like. So I think there's three take homes that I took from this particular study that I wanted to share. One, Adolescents with high cognitive ability do not seem to be at higher risk for mental health issues than their typical peers in Flanders, because that's the sample they looked at. Is this also true of adolescents in Colorado? I have no idea. This study does not tell us anything about that. If we want to know that answer, we're going to have to go to Colorado and conduct a similar study. This study doesn't tell us anything about adolescent experience in Colorado compared to Belgium. Is it massively different? I actually don't know a whole lot about what adolescent experience is like in Belgium, though I would love to go find out. Second take home is that actually high cognitive ability might serve as a buffer against some of these negative social and emotional outcomes, it looks like. In adolescence, would high cognitive ability serve as a buffer against some of these negative social and emotional outcomes in 8-year-olds or in 5-year-olds? Great question. But again, this study doesn't tell us anything about that. I think it's important to keep in mind. What I think this study does tell us a lot is that how giftedness is identified can really create an appearance of problems that may not exist, but it depends on who you're actually looking at. If you're looking at the students who were identified as gifted in this community, there were more likely to have problems than their general peers. But that's a, a function of how giftedness was identified. If you're really interested in high cognitive ability students, a lot of those problems were not more prevalent in that population compared to their peers. So I think it's really, really important to think about how giftedness is identified dictates and determines who we actually see, which is one of the reasons why I'm really excited why Colorado is getting universal screening and universal assessment. So Colorado should avoid some of these selection bias problems that came about in this study, and so that you're going to be able to find kids who hopefully would benefit and flourish in a gifted and talented program more easily without missing them because of this incoming universal screening that I don't know if it's next year or the year after, but I know it's coming and I'm very excited about it. So now we've talked a little bit about identification. Let's talk about services and programs. And one take home that I'd hope you all can remember is that differentiating down is more common than differentiating up. What is differentiating down? What is differentiating up? I want to talk about this particular paper that focused on differentiated instruction. So differentiated instruction, just broadly, is where students remain in the general classroom, and their teachers may differentiate or change the instruction, the assignment, the activity, or whatever the experience is for students from what's typically in the class. So differentiating down would be maybe to help kids who are maybe behind or below grade level. You would differentiate to help make sure the instruction or the assignment matches their learning needs so it's within their ability level so they can still participate and still get something out of the instruction and the experience. Differentiating up would be to change the instruction or the assignment to match the learning needs of kids who are maybe above grade level or who are ahead of their peers. So that's so this study is all about differentiated instruction in that mixed ability general classroom. And this isn't just a study where they collected some data in Belgium or in Colorado. It's a systematic review. So what that means is they looked at all the published articles on differentiation and they reviewed what do those have to say to be able to report back some general trends about what does differentiation look like, particularly for those high achieving students in the general classroom. And I think this is really important because in many schools and many communities and many grade levels, differentiation, it may not be the only service that's offered to gifted students, but it might be a primary or a major service that's offered for gifted and talented students. So what did they find? So first it's like, well, how often, how much research is there on there? And what this systematic review found was that overall, the evidence regarding the impact of differentiated instruction on high achieving students is sparse and partially of low quality. Sparse and partially of low quality. So sparse means there's just not that much of it. And what is there, maybe it's not that good. So when I see this, I kind of think of like if I were to take my glasses off, it's of low quality. I can still see, but what I'm seeing is of low quality. It's not really crisp and clear. And when I see the research being sparse and partially of low quality and differentiation for high achieving students, I don't think, well, let's make sure this is the primary thing that we're doing and this should be done regularly for high achieving students. I think, well, what do we not know and how can we know it better before we start implementing and using this at massive scale? Because if the research supporting it there isn't that much of it and it's not that high quality, how can we make it better? How can we know more about the effects of differentiation on high achieving students? So remember, everything else I'm about to say about this is based on not that much research, and the research methods not that high quality. So let's keep that in mind. So the next question they asked in the systematic review is differentiated instruction used? Particularly that's differentiation up. That is what I'm going to be talking about here, where the teachers are trying to change what they're doing to meet the learning needs of those kids who might be ahead of the class and particularly high achieving. And they looked at this four different ways across a bunch of different research studies. Some research studies just ask teachers, do you differentiate up for your high achieving students? Other research studies had the research team actually go do a bunch of classroom observation. And one of the things that they were tracking and recording was, are teachers differentiating for their high achieving students? A third way this question was answered is by just actually directly asking students, are your teachers differentiating for you? Fourth way, they asked administrators. So I see a little smile, so I wonder if you've got a prediction of what I'm about to share.
Well, I'm willing to bet the self-reporting of the administrators and the teachers was much higher than the classroom observations or student responses.
Oh, so you think the teachers and the administrators were maybe optimistic and
Yeah, yeah. I
okay.
think they were like, yeah, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And the students were like, no, they're not. But we also have to consider the source,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, I
Right.
think
I think classroom observations would probably be the cleanest data because the people who are doing the observations are the ones who have defined what that's supposed to look like. And they are looking for their definition of what that's supposed to look like.
yeah, so hopefully the
Yeah.
observers have some expertise and training to be able to identify and spot it so that when it is happening, they can actually see it. So yeah, I love your idea of like let's keep the source let's in mind to see what they have to
Hmm.
say. So let's talk about teacher self-report. Again, this isn't just one study or one school or one classroom. This is a systematic review of all the research that they could find on differentiated instruction and about differentiating up for those high achieving students in their class. So teachers in their self-report say actually they don't really consider high achieving students. And in general, they make no or only minor changes in their regular curriculum for high achieving students. And the classroom observations say that, yeah, most high achieving students did not receive a differentiated instruction aimed at them regularly. So the teachers are actually well, they're being honest. Maybe that's not the outcome that we are hoping for, but they're saying, yeah, we really don't consider the high achieving students. So they're not different. They're not saying that they're differentiating up, and the classroom observations generally mirror that. And when researchers ask students, more than two-thirds said that their instruction is also it's not differentiated and that they learn the same content at the same rate, same time, same pace as other students. So it's not getting that change. However, when you ask administrators, the ones who aren't in the classroom, 86% responded that differentiated instruction for high achieving students in their classrooms exists, but they do acknowledge that actual use varies across teachers. So that's where maybe we're seeing some of that optimism you were talking about that, yep, it exists, but it's going to be some variability. So when I see this, I think, oh, it's actually probably not being used all that much, or regularly. But does it work when it's actually being done? When it is being done, does it actually have a positive effect? And now remember, this is all based on research, a little bit of research that's of generally low quality. But they actually found that's mainly positive for high achieving students, that when it's done, it is positive. But again, this is like me looking at the screen without the glasses. It looks pretty good, but I'm not really seeing clear, crisp answers. And they're saying that this pattern of effectiveness was found for studies of a lot of different research designs and aligns with prior research syntheses. So when it's done, it's actually worked. That's promising. That's good. And so the conclusions that the authors of this study made, just to highlight, is that the evidence is generally weak about differentiating up and that in general it's not really being used by as the default in regular classrooms, but this is where they say it's a promising approach for the promotion of high achieving students in mixed ability classrooms. So it's got promise, but that's when I think about a promising approach, I think of like when a sports team drafts someone based on their promise, that's on their potential, which is, which could be a good decision. It could be worthwhile, but it's not based on what's the prior track record of evidence for something. So, if differentiated instruction is promising, but it's not really, clear and crisp, what is a service that has research evidence that we'd say, oh yeah, that's looking really good? This is the first time I've done this while on my computer, and I realized these are polarized, so I can actually see nothing on the screen. So I'm going to take them off and put my other glasses on, so I actually can see clearly. The sixth take home I'd love for you to know is that academic acceleration comes in many flavors and varieties, but this is the form of service for gifted students that actually has the research evidence showing that it's generally effective. So this is one project that I'm actually talking about that I'm a co-author on it. This is back when I was at Duke. So this was published 9 years ago now, where with my colleagues Saying Steenbergen Hu and Paula Olszewski-Kubilius, we also did another systematic review. We looked at 100 years of research, all the published research that we could find on ability grouping and on acceleration. What effects does that have on K through 12 students' academic achievement? Now, when I say acceleration comes in many flavors, it really does. This is not my distinction. This is some folks from the University of Iowa just gave examples of what are the types of acceleration. Early admission to kindergarten, early admission to first grade, grade skipping may be what often people think of generally, but that's one type. But there's a lot of different flavors and types of acceleration. And I color coded these. There is a method to my madness. All of the ones that you see in yellow are some form of early adoption, where it's the same thing. Early admission to kindergarten, the kid still goes to kindergarten. They're in the regular classroom. They're just getting that same experience sooner than they would have otherwise. And that's one component of acceleration that's very common is the timing. When does something happen? What actually is happening isn't any different. It just happens sooner. Whereas then when you look at the four that are in pink, I'm sorry, the four that are in green, where it's continuous progression, self-paced instruction, curriculum compacting, those really change the pacing of when learning is happening. So in curriculum compacting, maybe a student goes through 2 years worth of math in only 1 year. So the curricular experience could be the same, but it's just compacted so that it goes through it faster. And those are the two big changes and big differences that I think acceleration affects. It's either the timing of when something happens or the pacing. The pink color is that's not necessarily available to everyone. Things like mentoring and extracurricular programs and distance learning, those are vary um, in availability to different students. And AP and IB, those are set specific curricular that someone else makes. And credit by examination, and that's actually an interesting form of acceleration because it's actually the difference is that often students don't take the course then because if they can demonstrate they've already learned all or most of what they need to learn from a particular curricular experience, and they don't need to take it. It's almost acceleration through subtraction. Don't make them sit through a class or a course where they already know what they need to learn from that particular program. So just show this to make sure people feel comfortable when we're talking about acceleration, is that there's a lot of variability in different forms of acceleration. But one consistent piece about acceleration is that the research shows that it's generally effective, and the benefits are consistent and sizable in helping students learn more than they would have if they weren't accelerated in that particular program. It's really almost amazingly consistent, and how big the academic benefits are, which is actually, maybe it's not all that surprising if a lot of these kids already know what they would have been taught otherwise. Well, then you put them in another environment that's closer to their learning needs and they learn more. Like, of course that happens. And actually, so how much, what about the costs? How much does this cost? Actually, it can save money. So think about just for grade skipping, instead of spending money to fund educating a kid for 13 years, if you only have to, if they finish it in 12, that's a whole year of funding that's not being spent. And the kids are actually showed that they're learning more while spending less time in school. I almost feel like you should be saying, wait, I don't trust that. That sounds almost too good to be true. Spend less, but the kids learn more. That sounds like something I'm not supposed to trust a research saying, but don't trust it because I'm saying so. We actually published this great, really long paper saying that that's generally what the research found. But despite that, my general sense when I have these conversations with school principals and superintendents and parents is that we're afraid of academic acceleration. And one of the most common versions of why we're afraid of it that I hear is, especially from principals or superintendents, is, oh yeah, we tried that once. My brother's neighbor's cousin's nephew's school, they accelerated a kid one time, and I don't think it went very well. So we never do it. And that just kind of baffles me a little bit. I'm not trying to question the reality of that anecdote or of that individual experience, but I once got sick in an Italian restaurant. Does that mean no one should ever go to an Italian restaurant? That's just not how we make decisions here. Is the like, oh, I know someone who had a bad experience once, therefore no one should ever do anything like that ever again. That's not how we make decisions in our life in other areas. Why are we doing it here? And maybe, to give people the benefit of the doubt, it's because they're like, well, I'm worried and I don't want to make a mistake. And I know that experience. But again, what the research says is that's not oh, it didn't work out so well is not the norm. It may have actually happened. I believe it. I was actually listening to a podcast, and the musician John Legend was sharing that he was homeschooled, and then when he went from homeschool to traditional schooling, he was grade accelerated 2 grades. And he says it didn't go great for him, and he wasn't super happy with it. I'm not questioning John Legend's story about his own experience. I believe it to be true. But as a researcher, what I want to know is his experience the typical experience, or is it the exception to the norm? And what the research generally says is what's typical is that academic acceleration is hugely beneficial academically. But then what about social emotionally? Is your child going to fit in with the other kids in the classroom who may be older than them? And again, as I said earlier, when the question comes to specifically about your child, I don't know. I don't know your child. You know your child better than I do. And if that is a big concern for you, then I think you should take that into account. What I hope you also take into account is what the research generally says is that it could be okay. And one thing and this is a policy question that I think is worth investigation, is when there's a social emotional concern Is it because of the worry of that kid being the only kid in that environment? Would that concern be as strong if instead of one kid being accelerated, there were four or five? So they're not the sole own lone outlier. And there's four or five in that classroom, but there's four or five in every classroom. So it doesn't feel like, oh, that's strange. Why is that one kid the only kid in the school doing something different than everybody else? If acceleration were socially normative, and so that every classroom had some kids, would the social emotional concern be as strong? I don't have the answer to that. That's I think, a valuable research question to ask. But when in some other research that I've done that I won't get into here, what we've looked at is how many kids might be ready to move up to a higher level of math or a higher level of reading. It's a really large number. So in some grade levels for in reading, it might be that a third of the classroom could be from a lower grade level. And my hunch is if it's normal for every kid in every classroom that they're in, they just get used to having students from multiple ages in that particular classroom. My guess is that becomes normal and it doesn't feel like such a standout experience. But that is a claim I am making that I do not have evidence on. And I'm trying to be nuanced there so I'm not a hypocrite, at least in this particular case. So for all different types of services and assessment, Jonathan Plucker, who you said many are familiar with, and Carolyn Callahan a couple years ago did a broad assessment of the evidence of a variety of different services. They looked at what is the strength of evidence for this particular service. And they said that services like acceleration, ability grouping, curricular intervention, and that's where it's like in the classroom, they really change the specific curricula that's being offered there. Those three services have the strongest level of evidence, but it may not be what they call the gold standard. And that has to do with the like how many randomized controlled trials interventions are there that have actually tested these particular services. So they're saying of the services that are typical for gifted education, those three have the strongest evidence, but it may not quite meet the gold standard. Services like enrichment, AP, and IB, they say it's generally strong, but they think more research was needed. And then when you get down toward the bottom, you see things like that grouped differentiation that we just talked about a couple minutes ago. And then the psychosocial interventions, they say there's little evidence of effectiveness there. Although to be fair, they wrote this before the systematic review that I'd talked about. And my take home from my conversations about acceleration, this was my lesson, was that I think research is necessary, but it's insufficient for change. If we have strong research and say this general policy works or this intervention works, I think that's really necessary and important. But that doesn't mean schools and teachers and parents are automatically going to change automatically what they do because other things matter too. And that's where I think your advocacy really matters and the strength in numbers. If the only group of people who are trying to get appropriate and effective and sufficient services for gifted students are people like me, we're not going to be all that successful. I think the places that I've seen that have the most and biggest effects of getting support, getting services, that's where parent groups like this one are so, so important. And I think it's no coincidence that Colorado has a parent group that has monthly meetings where people talk about gifted issues. And Colorado also happens to be a state that's getting universal assessment and screening for gifted services. I don't think that's a coincidence because I think having real strength in numbers, like an advocacy group that meets regularly to talk about how can we help gifted students flourish, I think that's so, so important to actually leading to real policy change and implementation. And another way of doing that, this is the last point I want to make, is that I think arriving at a destination is so much easier when you have a plan for what that destination is. And that's a fancy, maybe bumbly way of asking, My favorite question that I always like to ask whenever I'm talking to a parent or whenever I'm talking to a school or a gifted program coordinator is I want to ask them, what does success look like? What are you trying to accomplish? So that when you're advocating for your child, or if you're thinking about what services you want to offer in your school, what is success? What is that destination that you're trying to reach? If you don't have a clear answer, I don't know how you're going to get there. Whenever I leave the house and get in the car, I have a clear destination in mind. That's how I know whether or not to turn left or right out of the driveway to know where I'm going. If I don't have that clear destination in mind, how will I ever get there? And I think that makes perfect sense when we're in driving our car. But so often when we think about advocacy or we think about what programs and services that we're going to offer in our schools, it's amazing how often we don't have a clear, articulate answer of this is the destination that I'm trying to get to. And I'm pushing for you to try to think about what is your answer when you're thinking about when you're trying to help your kid or when you're trying to think about how you can make the best program that you can. What does success look like? Because in some instances, it's very clear. Here's me with Tyler George and holding his Olympic gold medal. I'm the one holding it, but it's his Olympic gold medal that he won at the Olympics in curling. His destination, his definition of success was very, very clear. Not always as clear when we're talking about advocacy for that. And another part that I think is really important to mention is setting realistic goals. Winning a gold medal is not a realistic goal for everybody. This is a actual quote from my wedding vows with my wife. We will always strive to be patient. We thought that a realistic goal was this. We thought actually being patient with each other was not necessarily a realistic goal to have for us. So we wanted to set a realistic goal. So we said we're going to strive to be patient. That was something that we could achieve. So that I just mentioned this because A, I think it's funny and we're still striving. And I think we've been successful so far, is to think about not just what does success look like, but can you make realistic goals? It's great to have these long-term goals and keep in mind too, to be able to reach them incrementally, but what are realistic and incremental goals that the things that you can work for as you advocate for your child or your particular program? I know I said I was told to go a little slow. I did that a little bit. Maybe I went too slow and rambled on too long. Those are 8 things that I hope are useful for you in your daily life and as you advocate for your child or your program. And I'd love to talk about 8 other things that are of interest to you.
Well, I was making a note, and I did make a note in the comments that if anybody had any questions, to please go ahead and share those right now. So we're waiting to see if some of those pop in. But I have notes. I always take notes.
Okay.
As you were talking about how we interpret research, I wrote, "Can you come talk to my high school English students, or just high school students in general?" You know. But I also think like it's just a good message to hear that we can't take these singular studies or singular anecdotes and extrapolate them to a broader population without really understanding what those studies are saying. And we sometimes we infer too far, you know?
Yeah, because and it's often done with the best intentions. And so I don't want to vilify people for doing it. And sometimes it's Lorne Michaels, another late night legend, says we don't go on because the show is ready. We go on because it's 11:30. And I feel like that's where people like in your situation is, when you go teach tomorrow, you don't teach because you've got the most perfect, well-supported pedagogy or curriculum. You're going to go teach tomorrow no matter what
Yeah.
because there's kids who need to learn things, and you're going to do the best that you can with what you've got. And I think that's I don't know what else you could do. But it's our job my job as a researcher and our job as I think as a society is to make sure that we're giving you all that you need as much as we can so that you can be as an effective a teacher as possible. And I think, and because there's that gap between, well, we need to teach these kids tomorrow. We can't just sit around and wait 20 years till we get something perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But then we don't have all the answers. So sometimes it's that necessity of this, of the timing and the situation where it's like, well, there's that research study that was done in Belgium. I don't have any other information, so I'm gonna do what I can to kind of extrapolate and say, is this relevant to my context in Colorado? And until you get more and better information, I don't know
And
what else you could do.
I appreciate like what you said about like the tools that you use to identify will identify the students that are reflective of those tools, right? Like, so what are we using to identify students and then and what types of students are we seeing as a result of the identification? The great thing is Colorado's been doing so we have universal screener funds and I think we're going to be fully funded this next year. They just got through like budget stuff. But it's we've been doing universal screener in Colorado for a good while, and our identification numbers have kind of gone up across the spectrum of ability. And we've been working a little bit more heavily in arts identification and stuff like that as well. And again, yeah, you're not going to do a music performance assessment evaluation for an arts identification for a student who wants to be identified in painting. You know, so it's the
I
it's
hope not. I hope
yeah,
not.
it's the tools that we use, and even it goes down to like the this type of test that we perform. You know, like if you're going to do an hour and a half COGAT on a student with a documented ADHD, you're probably not going to get the results you want.
Yeah.
You
But
know,
then it's
and so
also, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to keep in mind of what's the service for?
mhm,
Because I don't want to leave students with ADHD outside of any service,
mhm,
but there's a lot of
mhm,
services that we offer where those kids are going to really struggle if
mhm.
they can't put their head down and focus and concentrate. And because not because there's something wrong with them, but it's we may be limited in what we're
Programming.
actually offering in our
Mhm.
services.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I was thinking about the differentiating up piece. And it's that differentiation is just such a struggle for classroom teachers, especially in heterogeneous classrooms, you know. And I think about how hard it is to do all the things. And I even see master's teachers who struggle with that, you know. And so I've always leaned on the side of acceleration. And when you got to that point, I was like, yes, it's so validating because it I do understand all the concerns that parents have with it and but I and administrators and everything like that because yes there's always the one anecdote that's brought up well we did that with and so therefore and I'm like well what was your method what was your how did you do it what was your transition did you use these protocols to help you ensure that you were phasing them in and out of their classes in the correct way and it's just it's I think it's refreshing to hear that again because I think we've heard it a lot in the gifted world. It's nice to hear it. I think people outside of the gifted world need to hear it as well.
Yeah.
Um, because sometimes it
Anything.
might be great for kids who aren't even necessarily identified. But to be able to in a certain area, maybe they have a passion area and like in science or something, and they need to be accelerated in science for them to be challenged and learn and grow as a student. But I did write a question down here, and I'm looking for some more questions to come in. But I did write a question. You had in red combined classes. Did I miss you talking about the combined classes on the acceleration slide?
Oh, that might have been. I may have not have overlooked that. Oh, because that was red and not one of the other
Yeah,
colors.
yeah. And
So
of course,
so
me, I'm like, what does that mean?
oh well red and maybe I don't I think I did omit that one and that's probably hilarious given what red means to me was that's for me that's my personal take was that I don't know how I feel about combined classes being considered acceleration.
And
And
what
so
do you
that
mean by
red was
that, combined classes?
so
That's
combined classes, it could be what this is where I believe it's literally like you're just taking like two multiple grade levels and putting them into
oh,
one room.
okay.
Now, that could be an opportunity for acceleration, but that's going to really depend on what the teacher does in that environment. And
I
so
think of
if
like
they re
cluster grouping and doing that like across grade levels and doing a cluster grouping model and then having like, you know, that's
yeah,
the
so
only thing that
cluster
would work.
Yeah, so cluster grouping, where I think of things like that, of like grouping, is that setting is not a service.
Yeah,
And so you could cluster group students based on their achievement or based on their ability, but then if you just show all of your clusters
the
the
same
same
thing. Yeah,
movie,
they don't do anything.
you put them in a different setting, but you
Instruction
actually
has to
haven't
change.
provided a service. And so
Yeah.
that's why I put it in red of the like it could be, but then you're going to have to do something like differentiation, or you're going to
Uh-huh.
have to do grouping. You're going to have to do something else
Or
and
telescoping
not
or
just put
compacting
students.
or yeah.
Yeah. And so that's where I put that in red, and you're right, I did skip over it just because I have some concerns of like I don't know how confident I am about that unless I know more about what actually is
And
happening.
that's also something you bring up that like just changing the setting is not providing a service. And sometimes I think we do fall on that where we change the setting and we say, "Oh, we're providing an opportunity for the student because we put them in a different room or we put them with a different teacher or we put them, we move them to a different school." Well, if the different school is not doing anything different than the school they were at previously, a title does not change the services that kids are provided.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly. Maybe it provides an opportunity for that, but then we still have to do something more. Something
mhm.
else has to change. And that's where my big take home for a lot of acceleration is the timing of what's happening changing, or is the pace of what's happening changing? Or you could actually change like they're getting a different curriculum.
Yeah, then that comes back to down to that piece where the advocacy and it's like about I think one of the biggest struggles as a parent is that what we hear happens in the classroom, we hear from our students' perspective, you know? And so being really knowing, first of all, knowing how to ask the right questions. So what like it's the researcher, right? It's the researcher. What's the right question I need to ask the teacher to see if what is I'm hearing at home is what's being done in the classroom? Because student perception and teacher perception can be very widely varied, and what's actually happening sometimes might be in between. And so, how do we ask the right questions as a parent wanting to advocate for our students for differentiating up or better opportunities or acceleration, and then like understanding what that end goal is. So, is there any advice as a researcher that you have for teachers for parents? I'm sorry, for parents for determining like how to ask the right questions to determine what's happening and how to get the answers that you're seeking because I feel like sometimes that is the biggest challenge is knowing what's really going on in the classroom and how do we get to that to know what our next steps are.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And from my experience, is that it's really important for parents to understand and have a relationship with the teacher and to understand what are the teacher's goals and what is success in their mind. Because in the US, I mean, going back to No Child Left Behind over 20 years ago, the general kind of air that we breathe when it comes to success in education has been universal minimum proficiency, which I think is which is a great goal to have.
Yeah.
I would love to have universal minimum proficiency. However, I don't know if that should be our sole goal
Yeah.
in education. Because if that's our sole goal in education, there's a lot of kids, gifted and otherwise, who are going to go to school day after day after day after day, and they're going to be taught what they already know.
Mhm.
So if we have a mindset of that's sure, universal minimum proficiency, great goal, but what about, and this is Julian Stanley, who's stole my line well before I ever thought of it. I wish I'd thought of this line. His idea of success, which I find generally teachers and principals can generally get behind, is that we should teach students only what they don't already know. They already know it. We're not teaching it to them. They're going to be bored. And so if we can talk to teachers about what does success look like for you? What are you trying to accomplish? And if they can get, and if, if they don't have a strong answer, or if it's universal minimum proficiency, could a parent bring up, well, for me, my goal for my child is I want to make sure that when they come to school, they learn something new every day, or that they're not being taught what they already know. How is that going? How is my kid doing in your classroom? Are they learning new things or are they largely spending their time being taught what they already know? And in my experience, when you try to frame it that way, teachers don't want to say, "Oh yeah, I spend most of my day teaching your child what they already know." Like they don't want that. That's not, no one says that's success for me.
Mhm.
But if when framed that way, then you can kind of form a team as parent and teacher. If you have that shared vision of what does success look like, then as a team, you can say, what can we do to make sure we're taking the right steps to achieve that particular shared goal and shared destination. And that can be hard and that can be easier when you have a relationship, but to at least have clearly articulated teacher parent, here's our goals, here's what success looks like.
Yeah,
And if there may be differences and maybe a gap, which is not unfair, not unrealistic.
yeah,
But when you have that, and then what can we do to achieve this? I think that's when you start to get to the point where you can have the realistic follow-up questions of how are we doing actually accomplishing these goals? Is that helpful or useful at
yes,
all?
yes, yes. I'm just thinking as from a parental perspective, you know what? Sometimes the struggles were was like you hear what was going on in the classroom and you're like, I don't know. And but being able to have those conversations where you say, what do I want to see my kid be able to do by Christmas or by the, what are some things and what are we doing to move them forward? And we using collective pronouns is helpful, right?
Yeah, and because sometimes teachers are doing all that they can, but they have limitations in what they're able to do too.
Yeah.
But they can also be an advocate. So it's like maybe if the right answer is not differentiation in that particular classroom, but for some kids, the right answer may be they need to be in a different room. And it's not that what the teacher is doing is wrong or bad, but this is what this teacher is supposed to be doing at this time. If that's not the right fit for that particular kid, if we can make parent teacher the we, that teacher could be a great inside advocate in those other rooms where parents aren't part of the conversation. They can be an advocate for that kid to say, actually, for this kid, they may not be in the right place at the right time. We
Mhm.
need to get them in some other room.
Yeah,
And that's something where if we as parents can get teachers to say those things and to be those advocates, I think that's where again that strength in numbers can you
for
can
sure.
really see more effective and just more action.
I think that's it's yeah, it's all about the we. No,
Yeah.
I and team, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't see any questions popping up on our feed tonight, but uh, what we will do is post your recording to our website, and then it creates a wealth of resources for all of our Colorado and abroad, like anybody who can access our website. But our Colorado teachers and districts use these resources all the time to help guide parents and teachers and administrators across the state. And so we've been really, really thankful to have people like you join us. And you are our last presenter of the 2024-2025 school year.
Oh wow. It feels weird to say happy summer then. I guess
I know, but it's only like 4 weeks away for most of us. So
yeah.
we're on the home stretch, is what I'd say, or this home sprint to
Yeah.
the end of the year.
4 weeks is a long sprint. That's a long time to sprint. So
It sure is, but it feels like it goes nonstop. They call it Maycember, right? All the things that you do in December, the programs and the plays and everything. Now you're doing it in May, and it's just sprint to the finish line. So, but we really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to meet with us tonight and share us with this information. And I took a lot of notes and I got a lot out of it. So I hope that our viewers did too. So, and on cue, my family just walked in the door and we're getting ready to start dinner.
great.
So,
Was great being with you.
yes.
I really did mean it. I'm happy to talk or share emails with anyone who's got additional follow-up questions or wants to learn more about anything I shared. And I hope you and your family have a great dinner and a happy sprint to the end of the school year.
Yes, we're off to the races. Thanks so much, Matt. I really appreciate it. Everybody who watched with us tonight and have a good night. Enjoy your evening.